Hello. Welcome to Lato Files and UAP Society. We have very exciting guest today, Dr. Dean Radin. So Dr. Dean Radin, I'll go ahead and play this introductory video here. Radin.
So haven't had your mind blown
Dean
by the
Radin,
double slit experiment, then you haven't
I'll go ahead
looked
and play
into
this
the double slit
introductory
experiment.
video
I mean,
here,
originally
Radin.
done back in 1801. Haven't had your mind blown. This experiment has been blowing minds since then. Quantum mechanics is just a mess because of it. All the YouTubers have covered it. Vsauce covered it. Veritasium, Joe Scott, all of them have gotten their minds blown by this. Recent experiments have shown that maybe we actually finally have an answer or even a hypothesis for what could be going on in the double slit experiment. And it really shakes all of science to its core, and I think they're not willing to look at it. I think this experiment could be the key to finding out what's going on, what is up with our messed up model of the universe. Why do we require so much crazy math in these ridiculous matrices that not even our most complicated computers can solve? It seems like we're just missing some really key point of information. And I go through it in this video, what I think that could possibly be very exciting. So we've been at the same spot for 80 years. Maybe we're looking at the problem in the wrong way. Thank you for being here.
Excellent. And let's see here. Okay. So Dean Radin has a PhD. He's chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Science and associate distinguished professor of integral and transpersonal psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is author or co-author of hundreds of scientific, technical, and popular articles, including 4 books. Okay, so Real Magic is one of them. You may have seen these, along with Supernormal. Okay, and then he has 2 others, Entangled Minds and Conscious Universe. And mentioned ION's Institute of Noetic Science was started by Edgar Mitchell. So originally Edgar Mitchell to look into these potentially anomalous scientific studies, which Dr. Radin has done. And so very excited to talk with him today. Let's go ahead and bring on Dr. Radin. Hello, sir. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Excellent. So yeah, I'm very excited for your work. And like we were talking before, you said it has been actually replicated several more times. So we'll talk of that in the future. But I guess how did you get into this science? How did you get into this field of study? Very difficult field of study, which little mainstream scientists get into.
Well, mainly as a matter of curiosity, right? Science is largely about being curious about reality. And so as a teenager, I read a lot of science fiction and fairy tales. And I think anybody with any sense of curiosity will start to wonder after a while, are these pure fantasy? Or as we know with mythology, is it actually based on something? Probably not the way that is portrayed in a story. Like when you go to see a movie, you know that that's not the way the real world works, usually. But there's something there. And so the reason why mythology and stories and parables and even fairy tales strike people as being interesting is because it's teaching something about the nature of the world that maybe science hasn't caught up to yet. And so that curiosity is what drove me. It drove me to the literature, talking about science being applied to psychic experiences. And I discovered that you can use the tools of science to study these things. And that only increased my curiosity. So that was already 60 years ago. And pretty much since then, I've been involved in the scientific study of psychic and mystical experiences and trying to figure out, well, what is that? Is it real? What does it mean? All those kinds of questions.
And have you seen it change recently? I'm pretty new to the topic, basically. You know, less than 2 years, a year and a half ago, I actually even considered it possible that there could be UAPs, UFOs. You know, that really kind of opened the door for me.
Mm-hmm.
And once I realized that I was limiting myself, you know, I was limiting the possible solutions based on kind of imaginary things, you know. And so for me, once that opened up, then it was like, okay, well, actually, what else is out there? Could we be communicating telepathically? Could this actually be a real thing? Are there psychic phenomena? And what you find is there's very little actual, seems like, science done on to actually find this information out. Has that changed recently? It seems like there has been a break in the UFO, at least in the UFO field. Have you seen a similar kind of change in the paradigm?
Well, is it recent? No, it's not recent at all. I mean, I know Jacques Vallée pretty well, and I think he makes a very strong case that the UFO / UAP phenomenon has been around as long as human history. It's thought of in different ways depending on the cultural context. Like a great example is the miracle at Fatima in Portugal in the early part of the 20th century. So there we have a case of what today we would probably call a UFO, seen by initially just a couple of kids, but then after it came back repeatedly by perhaps 10,000 or more people. Well, that would be considered a supermass sighting in today's terms, but the description of it was thought of as a religious phenomenon in the time. Today, it would be thought of in a technological or scientific way. And there are many, many cases like this that go all the way back through history, suggesting that the nature of the phenomena is not new, did not start in 1947 with flying saucers. It's been around. It's part of the human experience. So even when it comes to things like psychic phenomena, that you can go back as far in history as you want to, and you will find people talking about these kinds of experiences as far back as you go, all the way back to shamanism. So none of this is new. The only part that might be considered partially new is the application of science as a method to be able to look at these things. And of course, the great strength of science is having techniques to be able to separate out human frailties and biases from what might be going on in a more objective way. And we know, based on the Industrial Revolution and the technologies that we have today, that as a method is extremely powerful, but it doesn't account for everything. So even in science more or less began in the 1600s or even late 1500s. And the idea that you could apply scientific empiricism, meaning experimental work, you can apply that to things like telepathy and the psychokinetic effects and so on. That started from the very, very beginning. So Francis Bacon was one of the founders of modern science. He lived from 1561 to 1626. And one of his better known books was called Silva Silvarum, which is about nature. And the whole book is about how would you test if something is real? How would you learn if something was how it worked, and how would you simply know about it? And in that book, he discusses something. The book was written in 1627. So in 1627, Francis Bacon is saying, well, how would we know if the force of imagination is real? And by force of imagination, he's talking about what today we would call a psychokinetic effect, a mind-matter interaction effect. And he said, well, you could use something like there you go. You could use the tossing of dice to test whether you can give somebody an assignment to toss dice and get a number and see if the number comes up more often than you would expect by chance. Well, so this is already 500 years ago or 400 years ago. And it took roughly 300 years after he wrote that for systematic tests to start using dice. And that went on from 1935 roughly until about 1985. So for 50 years, scientists have been tossing dice and seeing whether or not your mind could somehow interact with the physical system and cause the results to conform to what you wanted. And then that changed into other methods, which we can go into later. But the idea is that these kinds of questions and interest has been around for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I guess what changed was in my own brain. Basically,
yeah.
I thought it was possible.
Yeah,
and
no,
and
this
I
is
think
it's
maybe
a,
I'm speaking for other people, but it seems like seems to be changing, because look at dark matter, we still don't know what's going, there's so many huge gaping questions in our science. It seems like the more we learn, the more holes we kind of see in our models or in our theories. And so it just, maybe it's just me, but it feels like people are more open-minded to actually look into science that maybe they wouldn't have even considered before.
yeah. So there are cultural reasons for that. And what you're saying is, it was best said by Terence McKenna, the guru of psychedelics. So this phrase has always stuck with me. He said, uh, the more the bonfires of knowledge grow brighter, the more the darkness is revealed to our startled eyes. And
Uh,
that's what you're referring to, that the more you begin to know about
yeah.
something, the more you realize all of the rest of it that you hadn't even realized was there. And that
Yes.
is part of the joy of science, that we're constantly learning more and more about things. And we know that because we change our textbooks about every 2 years. So one of the things that it teaches you is to be humble in the face of what we don't know. I mean, we can certainly enjoy what we do know, but the more we know, the more we realize what we didn't know before. So what I mentioned was about cultural changes. So in the 1960s, there were many, many more people, many more scientists involved in investigation of psychic phenomena, because a case can be made that society had also embraced psychedelics at the time, and it was blowing people's minds. So naturally, people got more interested in this. At the same time, meditation came from mysterious East into Western culture. So you had two things happening in culture, and I'm mainly talking about the United States, but everywhere in the Western world, which was telling people that the world is not exactly the way that we've been taught in elementary school. It's much more complicated than that. And in particular, there's something peculiar about the mind. Mind has capacities that we weren't thinking about before. So in the 1960s, there was a huge political pushback. Like at the time, like Nixon was the president in the United States, and there was a lot of students who did not think that the Vietnam War was very good, and the government got concerned about this because kids didn't want to go fight anymore. So there was a big crackdown, and basically all of the psychedelics were made illegal and pushed everything else away. So for a period of about 30 years from that point on, these kinds of ideas were not part of society anymore. It got pushed to the side. So that means that about 1.5 to 2 generations of people, of students or of humans, had no idea about any of this stuff. It simply was, it sort of disappeared. It was only out in the far fringe. Well, that began to change again, and we're now coming back into psychedelics. We know that meditation is very effective and has interesting results. And as a result, interest in consciousness, interest in psychic phenomena, interest in the quote powers of the mind are all significantly exploding all around the world. And so, and you can trace this back. You see kind of a cycle going through history where there are periods where people are very interested in it and looking into it, and then there's a reaction typically by governments that say don't do that. And so, fortunately, I think if you think of this as a cycle, it's not a flat cycle. It's a cycle that's sort of moving up. And so, the more scientists, in particular, they get interested in these kinds of things, the more the darkness will be revealed to our startled eyes.
Wow. Yeah. So you mentioned there psychedelics and meditation. I remember in your study, meditation actually made a difference, a noticeable difference. We
Yeah.
can get to that in a few minutes. But are you also dealing with meditation and psychedelic studies as well? Are you dealing with psychedelic studies?
Not specifically involved in meditation studies, although some of my colleagues are. It's rather that we tend to use meditators as subjects in experiments because, especially experiments involving mind-matter interaction, because those experiments are very abstract from a mental point of view. So I tell you, mentally do something over there. Well, that requires an active imagination plus highly focused attention. And meditation is all about attention focusing. It's training how to focus your attention. So those kinds of people who are practiced at it simply do better because they know how to focus their attention. It's really that simple. So if you bring someone into the lab and they're going to do some kind of a mental task and they have ADD or the equivalent, then obviously they're not going to be able to do it very well. So it's really that simple. To make it more complex, there's also a very long history, as I wrote about in my book, Supernormal, that when you begin to do meditation practice seriously, you will begin to bump into the whole range of psychic phenomena. And what is not generally known in the West is that was one of the things that was known for thousands of years. So you go back to like the first written book about yoga was the Yoga Sutras, written by Patanjali roughly 2,000 years ago. And an entire portion of that book is dedicated to the kinds of psychic abilities that will arise as a result of doing this kind of practice.
Well, yeah, I just actually I just started meditating really because people ask me to do it. I keep getting claims, and after a few months, just today I realized I'm starting to see actual benefits. Where I'm more relaxed. I think it can help with cravings, those sort of things, or addictions.
Sure.
I've seen my own benefits, and I've also seen recent studies on great benefits from psychedelics, actually, like psilocybin having a very high cessation rate for smoking, I guess, just preliminary results. So do you think there'll be breakthroughs on this end as well with psychedelics and interrelated to the sort of experiments you're doing?
I know that there are people doing research on psychedelics who repeatedly encounter various kinds of psychic effects, usually most commonly telepathy. And I know that they're interested in doing studies. We've discussed this, and we're reluctant to get into that space because it's still not easy from a federal point of view. So, I mean, in some states now, the use of psychedelics is okay. It's not illegal, but it might be illegal from a federal perspective. So, if you're doing experiments and you're then publishing it, and it's a little tricky to do that unless it's for a very specific medical purpose, like for treatment of depression and so on. And then you get special dispensation because it's typically being done in a hospital and so on. But for use in experiments like psychic experiments, it's a little bit like a binary bomb, that you have one element which by itself isn't bad and another element isn't bad, but you put the two together, it creates an explosive, and that's true even when it comes to ideas. So we eventually want to do this, but we haven't been able to at this point.
Yeah, I think and it's not even necessary, right? So why don't we move on to your actual experiment here. So this is from my video I made. Did we just find the UAP-consciousness link? It's one of my most popular videos, actually, which I was surprised because my channel was focused on UFOs and UAPs, and this video actually passed all of my UFO content. It has since been passed, but so this is just a short segment explaining the experiment that you did.
So I'm going to go through this very quickly. If you take elementary particles, quanta, photons, electrons, and so on, you send them through two slits, and you look at a screen to see what happens. If you don't know which of the two slits the particle went through, then you get an interference pattern. And this, of course, works just as well if you're sending a single photon or single electron at one time. The mystery is that as soon as you do know, by any means, which of the two slits the particle goes through, then you get a pattern that looks like it's particles.
Boom. That is the basic experiment.
Okay, so that's the double slit. But then what you did, what was very interesting, let me find it here, is you found, here we go. You explain it.
Is we built a double slit system, and fortunately it's a very simple type of a system. You have a laser, you have a filter, you have a double slit, and you have a camera that looks at the result. So the only new element in this experiment is we ask people, in this case, like a meditator, to keep the double slit in mind and to imagine in their mind's eye that they could see which of the two slits that the photon went through.
So I'll just stop here, Doctor, and ask, how did you come up with this experiment? It kind of reminds me of the dice. Is it just an extrapolation of those dice experiments you were talking about? Can they affect it?
It is, yeah.
Cool.
It's exactly what it is. And this particular experiment was a replication of one that had been done 10 years before. And so in 1998, there were two labs, one at York University in Canada, the other one at Princeton University in New Jersey. They both did this same experiment. And the experiment at York University showed no effect, but the experiment in Princeton did show a positive effect. So no one ever did anything with it after that. I mean, for 10 years, it was in the literature and no one did anything. So I decided, well, that would be an interesting experiment to do because I'm interested in the interactions between mind and matter. I'd done many other experiments in that domain. And more importantly, that this is directly connected to outstanding questions that are not solved in physics. All of the other experiments also that I've done are physics experiments essentially, but basically nobody outside of a small group of people are paying attention to it because
Yes.
it's not obvious to a physicist why they should care. Well, this one is using a very basic physics experiment with and testing one of the many interpretations of quantum mechanics. And so I thought, okay, well, let's see what you get. And so to my surprise and delight, you see interesting effects in this, which are completely relevant to interpretations of quantum mechanics.
Yeah. So basically, what you found is that when people were actively thinking about it, were actively, thinking about the experiment as an observer, a mental, I guess, telepathic observer, that you found statistically relevant results.
Yeah.
Right? That's basically what I understood from the actual experiment.
That's right. Yeah. So especially meditators did better than non-meditators, but they got results which were consistent with the idea that consciousness collapses the quantum wave function. And that whole issue is about quantum mechanics is a mathematical theory that predicts probabilities of things. It's actually even more elementary. It's possibilities of the way that things will happen. And so as long as you're dealing with any kind of physical system, all you have are complicated equations that describe what is likely to happen. But we live in a world where things apparently are here. We don't live in a world of probabilities. Well, we do. But I mean, we have actual objects out there. We have an actual world. And so the puzzling question then is how do you get from quantum potentials into classical actuals, classical physics actuals? What is that transition? So there are lots of proposals over the years that have been made by physicists, one of which is that there's something unusual about consciousness that is responsible. I'm not going to use the word cause because it's not, I mean, there are many different ways of thinking about causation, but there's some relationship then between consciousness and transitioning this potential state of the quantum world into the actual state that we live in. And so that then is really the underlying reason for doing this experiment, because if you can show that there's some aspect of consciousness, only consciousness, not your eye and not your brain and not not physical stuff, but your subjective internal awareness, if that can change something in the physical world, well, then that should be quite interesting to people, you would think.
And I think it sounds like this is what you're testing here, right? Is
Yeah.
this
So
basic whole model essentially, right? Because, and that's what you're challenging. Do you think the physicists aren't taking notice? It seems like when I look online, right, when I look at, they basically just think it's not correctly done. Their main argument is that the most likely it's just not done correctly.
yeah.
The actual scientific experiment, right?
Right. And
Which is what's great about science is you can replicate stuff.
Yeah, and also it's well known from a psychological perspective that if you start with a certain idea about the way that things work, You have a certain theory about the way the world works. Then if somebody comes along with an experiment that challenges that, there's a very predictable response. It's methodologically flawed, or it's fraud, or it's some other mistake. And there have been experiments actually showing that you send a paper, an experimental paper, right? Or an article describing some kind of experiment. And now you find people who agree with the underlying theory and people who disagree with the underlying theory. You send the exact same paper to all of them, and then you ask them to evaluate it. And the very predictable result is that if you agree with the underlying theory, you'll say, oh, this paper is amazing. It's good. It worked. And for the people who don't agree with the theory, they'll say, no, there's a methodological flaw. They missed something. They don't understand it, all of that. So what that shows is science is nowhere near as objective as we'd like to think. It is strongly influenced by a priori ideas about what you think is possible. So I'm not surprised at all that there are physicists who will look at the kind of work that I've done, and by the way, 4 other laboratories have done so far, and say, no, there's got to be some mistake in this, because this is somewhere between extremely implausible and literally impossible. So especially if you come at this from the point of view that this is impossible, well, obviously the experiment is flawed. It
Yes.
can't be true. So that's simply, it's par for the course when you're dealing with science, and not only for controversial areas, but for anything in science. So people sometimes ask me, so how do I deal with all the skepticism and criticism and so on? I would say, look at any journal in any field, not only science, but scholarship, philosophy, sociology, English literature, I mean, anything, and you will find people screaming at each other in these articles. I mean, really screaming at each other, saying, well, this person is stupid, they don't understand what's going on. And the reason is that the entire academic system, scholarship and science, is largely based on ideology. It's ideas, right? We're promoting ideas. We think the world works this way, and we think that this is the proper interpretation of this book, things like that from English literature perspective. Well, other people have different ideas. And so if I publish something and somebody comes along and says, no, that doesn't really match my view of how things work, it's not simply that you don't like what the other person has said. It can feel like a personal attack. It's like you're attacking the ideas that I hold deeply, and our ideas and our identity are very closely related to each other. And so you tell somebody, you present, well, look at this evidence here. It feels like you're getting hit in the face. So it's not surprising then that underneath a lot of the arguments in science is emotion. The stereotype of a scientist is there's like completely cool, there's no emotion, it's totally rational. That is a complete myth. That is not the way that it works.
Yeah, they tend to be quiet, I guess, in the public sphere, or supposedly quiet. But
yeah, that is not the way science works ever, anywhere.
Yes, it's funny what, and again, I've learned so much being a YouTuber, for the past 2 years, and especially in this difficult topic. And I come square into my own biases so many times now that I've learned to see it, and I really, once you see that you have biases and limits, man, it kind of opens the door. And that's what I hope, is that people, like me, I wouldn't have looked at the study, 2.5 years ago, right? Or it would have taken a lot, right? It would have taken a change, an epistemological change, or a paradigm shift, which is what it took, right? Which was, for me, was the UFOs, the UFO story from David Fravor, really, where he's engaging the Tic Tac from a fighter jet. And so I was a fighter pilot, so it really spoke to me, but before that event, I would have probably, like all the other people, is just discounted the results. It's got to be BS. That was the main statement on just Reddit, against your studies, is it's probably just BS. That was it. No actual reasoning, no actual study. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's common. Yeah. I mean, and if it's like anything where anytime you're working with especially controversial topics, there's always heat directed at you. And again, that's par for the course. If you don't like it, you don't want the criticism, we'll go do something else that is completely neutral and not controversial. And you find out pretty quickly, though, that, and as I said, in almost every field in science, you can do things that are in the mainstream. I mean, it's always more comfortable to be in the mainstream. But from my point of view, it was also more boring.
Yeah.
And I'm not interested in boredom. I'm interested in exploring what is the nature of the world really. And the moment you start doing that, as I have found from colleagues who are doing very mainstream work, were just shocked at the responses that they got from people the moment they strayed away from the mainstream. And so it teaches you very quickly, as you discovered, that there's a sociological set of acceptable things to talk about. And then there's a whole bunch of other things you're not supposed to talk about. Well, my curiosity pulls me out of that. I'm not interested in just following what other people are interested in. I want to follow what I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think our physical brains, like our physical biological systems, actually just blank things out. You know, there's a famous experiment. I did, pilot training. You did tons of these optical experiments, but where your nerve connects in the back of your eye, actually, there's a blank spot here and here, right? Where the nerve connects, but you can't see it, right? You may have seen online, or, the audience has seen online, you can see this spot, right? If you go the right direction. But otherwise, your brain just totally blanks it out, like literally does not see it. And this is perfect for when I go to look in the fridge, right? If my wife's like, hey, grab this out of the fridge, or I go to look and I will not see whatever it is I'm looking for. I don't know what this is, if it's in male brain, if it's just in my brain, etc. But I think that's it, where some of these things are just totally blanked over, But like you said, it's been replicated 4 other times. So 4 other times.
Well,
so is that breaking through, I guess?
There's 5 laboratories, but there's a total of 30 experiments that have been
30
reported.
experiments. And what is the overall percentage? Are they all positive, mostly?
14 of the 30 are statistically significant.
Okay.
So
wow.
From a statistical point of view, when I say significant, I mean a probability of 0.05. So you would expect with 30 experiments, if there was nothing interesting going on, you would have somewhere between 1 and 2 of those experiments to be significant. But you have 14. That's extremely unlikely to be a chance outcome.
14.
Yeah. So at this point, this is the double slit experiment, as I've been doing it, is a new kind of experiment. So it's really too soon to say that it is certainly not easily repeatable. None of these mind-matter interaction experiments are easily repeatable, but they are repeatable. I mean, if you look even back at the experiments involving dice and experiments involving random number generators and so on, overall, it's pretty clear that these are repeatable effects. The magnitude of the effect is small, and this bothers some people. They will ask, well, why isn't this done 100%? Why don't you get these huge effects? Well, because that's not the way the world works. A lot of things are really tiny, but they're quite real. A virus is really small, but it'll get you real sick real quick. So I don't really care about what is the magnitude of the effect. I care about whether it is real or not. And in this case, it looks like these are definitely real effects, because the experiment, as you've already pointed out, this experiment is part of a legacy of 100 years of experiments that are looking at the interaction between mind and matter. And so this is simply part of a long series of studies. And as I've said in every single one of my articles, that by itself, this would not be all that convincing, because it works sometimes, other times it doesn't work, and maybe there's a mistake in it. I don't think so, but maybe there is. So you just say, well, why would we think this? Why would we even try this in the first place? Because there's 100 years of prior experiments showing that something like this ought to work. It didn't just fall out of the sky. It was based on a very large additional literature, which says something like this should work. This one in particular that you're showing is very important, because we did 4 pilot studies. And when you do a pilot study, you're basically flailing around looking for anything interesting. A formal experiment then is saying, well, we think we found something, and now we're going to repeat it using methods that we had already devised. So we're not exploring anymore. We're trying to confirm that the effect that we saw before is real. And so we did that formal experiment, and it worked amazingly well. And so there's of the 30 experiments that I mentioned, 3 are formal experiments, and all 3 of them worked. All of the other ones are exploratory because we're still trying to understand what are the parameters involved, and there's enormous amount that we don't understand very well at this point. But because the formal experiments are working, it gives greater confidence that we're dealing with something which is actually real.
I see. And so this was from 2013. And I remember it. I also, one section here we'll just cut to is you had this done around the globe, right? So you basically have everyone in their own computers.
Yeah.
And I love this. You basically show that it's independent, distance independent. And this is also really kind of what draws me to this is if that's true, then it's showing the universe could be non-local, right? Which is what we expect quantum, I guess.
Yeah, we already know that it's non-local from quantum entanglement. The question is, are effects of consciousness of the type of mind-matter interaction, is that also non-local? And the reason why that's important to study is because if you put somebody in front of an interferometer, like a double slit system, or in fact, in front of any physical system within a meter or 2 meters, there's always the possibility that the electromagnetic and magnetic fields around the body itself will influence the system. And an interferometer is extremely sensitive to things like changes in temperature. So you wouldn't normally think of it, but the body, of course, is a radiator. We're hot. And if that heat impinges on the interferometer, it could change the laser power output a little bit. It could change, could heat up the metal that's used in the double slit and make it a little bit wider. It can do all kinds of things. And the interferometer is sensitive enough so that it could see things changing down at the nanoscale, like the billionth of a meter level. And so it doesn't take much to do that. So I wanted to then say, well, let's go out of the laboratory where nobody is anywhere near this device and see whether we get similar results. So why would I think about doing that? Because this kind of thing has already been done in other experiments, far distances between the person and the physical target, and those work too. So I figured, okay, this is not a complete shot in the dark. This probably should work from any distance anywhere on the Earth. In fact, we think it will probably work anywhere in the universe, except that we can only do experiments on Earth at this point.
And so you mentioned a little bit on the reasoning. And you say in this basic, let's see if you have it here. I kind of mentioned it, but from what I understand is that your argument, or at least how I understood your argument back in 2013, is that the current view that we're looking at, or that are the current mainstream ideology, at least, is that the physics is the bedrock, right? So out of physics, so out of little gluons, subatomic particles, etc., we have elements which build into chemistry. And then out of chemistry, you have biology, right? Biology systems need chemistry. And then out of biology now, we have psychology. So my brain basically builds who I am. And so that builds consciousness. And so you proposed an alternate, right? To basically say we can't find any of this stuff. It doesn't seem to work.
The point
what
of
if we
that
put
was
consciousness?
the point
Actually,
of
consciousness as the base.
the point of the first thing that you showed about materialism is that from that perspective, it's extremely difficult to explain why consciousness, by which we mean subjective awareness, like your sense of awareness itself, we don't know how that could change anything outside of your body, right? There's no fields, no forces, no particles. Like we from a standard scientific perspective, which is materialism, assumes that everything is made out of matter and energy. We don't know how that would work. And that's one of the reasons why you see scientists saying sometimes, well, this is impossible. You know, any kind of psychic thing, whatever, it's not possible because they're making this assumption. This assumption, I'm not throwing it away because it is extremely powerful. It was on this kind of model that we're able to do this interview, right? The technology is based on it. The problem is that it does not account, this materialistic model does not account for why, when you taste a lemon, that you have an internal feeling of what it's like to have the taste. Because if you go from the outside and you follow everything about the chemistry and the biology and the neuroscience and the brain and everything, it doesn't show you anything about what it tastes like from the inside. It only shows you from the outside. So this has been a split. This inside-outside part of the world has been discussed by philosophers for thousands of years. It's the mind-body problem. And it persists today because from a scientific perspective, we don't know how to deal with it. So what that suggests, and you can see this throughout in the history of science, when you come up against a problem that you can't solve, it suggests that, first of all, something's wrong with your assumptions. But secondly, it says that, well, maybe all of the other assumptions are correct, but it's a special case, right? So physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, we're not going to throw those textbooks away because within those domains, it works pretty good. It's a special case. Exactly in the same way as classical physics is a special case of the description of the physical world. But now we know that it's only a tiny little part of the world. You have relativistic effects, you have quantum effects, which are more comprehensive ways of understanding things. So what I'm proposing then is that reductive materialism is really good, does not account for everything. So we now kind of push it back into this accounts for a certain constrained piece of the world. Well, what do we do about consciousness? And that's what that second picture is. It's a different philosophical set of assumptions. It says basically all of the esoteric traditions and a lot of philosophers say that really at the bottom is consciousness. It's the only thing that we know for sure. Everything else becomes an inference. So from this perspective...
Yeah, I've heard before the one thing we can prove is experience, right? Conscious experience. At least that's the only thing I can fully prove to myself is that I'm experiencing this. I don't even know if you're experiencing this, right? But I know I am. Maybe that's the one thing we can actually even prove. So this hasn't changed, I guess, since 2013. You have the same basic beliefs or
this is not about belief. These are about models. How do you maintain a model where the phenomena that you're seeing will work within that model? Because it doesn't work very well in the other model. So idealism is the complete flip side of materialism, right? Materialism, everything's made out of matter. And in idealism, everything's made out of consciousness in some way. We don't understand how yet. Well, no, I've actually moved on since then. So now I'm thinking that while idealism is the basis of all of the esoteric traditions, and that's why in my book, Real Magic, I'm talking about how in those traditions that magic is completely real. It is real in exactly the same way that our technologies work within materialism, right? All of our modern technologies are based on a model. The model is materialism. Magic is based on a different model. It's based on the esoteric model in which consciousness is fundamental. And as I was pointing out then, that the experiments looking at psychic phenomena are suggesting that materialism isn't really all that good as a model. You need something else. You need something like idealism. And so this book is really about philosophy, but it's cast in terms of traditional esoteric magic and showing how we have experimental studies showing that this kind of actual real magic exists. It's not just fantasy, it's a real thing. Since then...
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
So this was 2018. So since then, I'm thinking one of the problems with idealism is that we have no idea at this point, how do we get from subjective experience, consciousness, how do we get from there into physics in order to start the whole physical world again? Well, nobody knows how to do that. So there's another philosophy which is right between materialism and idealism. It's called neutral monism, or a different version of it called dual aspect monism. So I'm reading this book now. I don't know if you can see this. Let's see, how do I show this picture here? There.
And the deep structure of meaning.
Yeah. So the reason why dual aspect monism as a philosophy is interesting is because it says ultimately at the bottom, there is some holistic existence of which we have no contact with at all. Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist, called it the unus mundus, the one world. It's a holistic environment. It's very similar, actually, to what quantum mechanics says about the world. Quantum entanglement says everything is connected. It's holistic, right? It's one thing. But we don't have access to that. Out of the one thing emerges two things, one of which is mind and the other one is matter. Yeah, well, it's sometimes called double aspect theory, but it actually dual aspect theory is the other way. Yeah, it's dual aspect monism.
Yeah.
So this philosophy actually is a little bit more interesting because it is useful in then thinking about how can mind and matter interact. We know that it does. Like if you have an intention to do something, you can do it, right? You can make your body move and it does something. How that works, neuroscience is trying to understand that, and it's making progress, but I don't think it's ever going to get there unless it realizes at some point that mind is actually quite different than matter. They are related to each other, but not the same. And that's what dual aspect monism is about. The monism part is saying that it really is just one world underneath, but it splits. It splits in the mind, it splits in the matter. And the joy of that is that the matter side becomes science as we currently study it. Most of science is studied based on materialism. But there's this other side, which is also as real, just as real. And more importantly, they interact. So the metaphor here is this unus mundus, this holistic underlying reality, is like a coin, but the coin has a heads and a tails. The heads and the tails, when you look at them, look very different. And they have different properties, different shapes, different things, but they're part of the same coin. So heads and tails are tightly correlated. When the coin moves, both of them will move, but they're different. They're related, but different. So that's what this philosophy says. And it goes in, like every philosophy, enormous amounts of literature based on this. So there's lots of nuances based on these kinds of ideas that philosophers have been battling over for thousands of years.
Coin too, you can't see both sides at the same time, unless you bend the light or something. It's kind of interesting.
You have a mirror or something. Yeah, I mean, it's you can see both, but it's not so easy. Yeah. So the interesting thing also about dual aspect monism is that a number of the founders of quantum mechanics ended up at this philosophy as the one that was the best for them, because it's actually pretty close to ideas in quantum mechanics. And in particular, this notion of meaning. What is it that connects mind and matter? It's meaning. Well, what's meaning? What's the meaning of meaning? Meaning is a relationship. It's like me and something else are in a relationship, and that provides the meaning. And so the reason why I'm interested in this is because when we do an experiment with double slit or any other kind of physical target, we do that kind of experiment. What's the connection between mind and matter? It's meaning. We tell somebody, we want you to do this with this physical system. That creates a meaning loop between me and the thing. This theory would say that connection, that meaning connection, that relationship is the reason why things going on inside your head, meaning or mentally, is making the matter change. And I hesitate with words like make it happen, because that suggests it's causal. And it's not causal, it's acausal. And it's very difficult to think about how something could happen without causing it to happen. And to understand that, you need to, again, go back into philosophy and say, well, our ordinary way of thinking about causation is like a billiard balls, right? A billiard ball hit this one, hits that one, and then this happens, and so on. That's what we think of causation. But that's only one kind of causation. Aristotle called it efficient causation. But there's another kind. There's actually 4 types. But the other type that's relevant here is something like formal causation. A formal cause is you want a certain outcome to occur. And it does. It's like it's goal orientation. You don't care about what all the steps are between here and there. You just care about the end point of it. Actually, that's called final causation. Well, maybe something like that's going on, since there are different ways that things can happen. This might sound strange, but there are other strange things in physics that follow this. And probably the one that's the most relevant is the law of least action. So the principle of least action. This says that when something occurs in the natural world, it takes a route from A to B, which uses the least amount of energy. Well, how does it know how to do that? Well, it does it. And there are some explanations about maybe gravity does it, or you want to use the least amount of energy and it's testing itself along the way. But regardless of the underlying explanation, you can build up all of physics based on this idea, the principle of least action, all of it. And that then becomes interesting, because maybe it means that when I have an intention to do something, that it will achieve its goal, and it'll use whatever is the most efficient way of doing it. So if I want to influence a double slit system, the most efficient way would be for me to take some kind of detector and put it there. That would work. Mm-hmm. If I don't have that as a possibility, it'll figure out some other way of making that happen. And these are still strong mysteries in science as to exactly what's going on. But nevertheless, this has been discussed again within physics and philosophy for a very long time.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I did a recent video on Maxwell's demon. It's really a quite popular video as well, and I reference Jacques Vallée. Mm-hmm. And in a TEDx talk back over 11 years ago, he basically makes the argument, sounds very similar to what you're saying, and the way he frames it is he says that physics is studying, classical physics is studying energy, but they're missing the other half of the coin, I think, is information. He calls it the physics of information.
Yep.
And which to me relayed to Maxwell's demon, because I studied all through science. I was a chemist, material scientist, but I found it's so boring. Like you said, actual science so difficult, and it was super boring at the time. But obviously I loved it. I went into it. But really, what I was finding is they don't explain life. Like, none of physics really can explain why we would have increasing complexity. It has to come from like evolutionary biology. It doesn't seem like, at least I haven't seen it in physics, of how do they explain, life? Why would life be replicating? And I think maybe it's in that whole element you just talked about, the missing part of physics, or information, as Vallée says.
I mean, within complex systems theory, there is the notion of self-organizing systems. And so there, you can trace all of the pieces are not in this jigsaw puzzle yet, but you can kind of trace from fundamental physics into complex systems theory, into figuring out why would evolution have developed something like a cell, and why would that develop into organisms, and why would that develop, and so on. You can make a story of that. That's a standard story within science today. The missing part there that science cannot account for is what we're discussing here. Why does that thing become aware of itself? Why does it create an internal representation of reality which we experience as our own awareness? That part is not well explained at all. In fact, that's still a complete mystery.
Yeah, and it seems like, so my question is, we have all these AI machines coming online, right? You have AI technical systems. I'm wondering if you have to start at a biological quantum point. Is each one of us, do we start at a quantum realm? Obviously we start at a sperm cell and an egg, right? So very small cells. But do you think a biological system will be required for consciousness? Or do you think it's possible that a machine could get consciousness without having that link that we have, or growing from some smaller point?
I don't think a classical computer can do that. A quantum computer might. And there is evidence just recently, in the last couple of months, of large-scale quantum entanglement in the brain. And so this is not too surprising, because quantum biology is now a discipline. And so more and more living systems have been shown that the quantum effects are not simply there, but they're important for the behavior of the living system. And so if the brain has elements that are working at the quantum scale, even if they're only happening at a femtosecond or extremely fast levels, the brain is dynamic. And so we'll be continually recreating quantum effects in the brain. Could that account for some of these phenomena we're talking about? And the answer is yes, because now it means that there's aspects of mind which are emerging out of all of this activity in the brain, and it's non-local, right? Most of it is local. It's driven by your local senses, but some of it could be non-local because that's one of the prime
few
differences.
more minutes.
That's one
So
of the
we'll
main
go ahead and
differences.
just do, we'll end on final questions here from our audience.
Oh, okay.
But before we do that, do you want to say what you're working on now before we go to questions from the audience, or what you see in the future?
I'm working on creating a large-scale replication of the double slit system.
Excellent. Yes.
And that what I mean is a multi-center replication, 50 different sites.
Excellent. If there's any way we can help at UAP Society, if you need volunteers, I'm sure they'll have people in the audience will be willing to volunteer or help in any way. But
Sure.
that's very exciting. Yeah. So let's see. Why don't we take some questions? Let's see. I saw one question earlier. Let's see. Go ahead. Sorry, if I can find it. And I missed it. What do you guys have? Ask questions for Dr. Radin. Please ask about astral projection. Okay. What about astral projection?
Yeah, what about it?
I don't know. I'm still just getting into these things, so I'm still a rookie. I've heard about it. People can practice serious meditating and then they have experiences where they leave their body.
Yeah. So it's related to out-of-body experiences, which is also related to remote viewing. So the difference between remote viewing is just a fancy new term for clairvoyance, the notion that you can perceive through space and time. The difference between that and out-of-body experiences or astral projection is that when the astral projection is the sense that you're not only perceiving something from a distance, it feels like you are actually there. That's the difference. So probably the closest analogy would be if you had a lucid dream. In a lucid dream, you're awake inside the dream. And so in the dream, you could be anywhere you want because it's a dream. Your imagination is driving it, but you're awake. So what we don't know at this point is, I do know people like way back when I was working on the Stargate program, which is the US government's remote viewing program. Some of those remote viewers also were able to do what they called astral travel, out-of-body travel. And they said there was a difference. It felt different to them. They felt like they were either there, sort of there somehow. They feel like your senses are actually working as though you were physically there, but you're not, as compared to remote viewing, which is more like a purely perceptual effect. You know that you're still here, except that you're getting information from a distance. So there seems to be some kind of a difference, but we don't understand what that difference is yet.
Oh, excellent. Let's see. Red Panda Koala. Wow, thanks for being here, man. Excellent. So great interview. Dean, are you familiar with Claiborne-Pell association with ions? Is there a Biden connection?
Yeah, I met Claiborne a couple times. He was actually a guest speaker once at a conference where I was at. I was sitting right next to him. He was interested in ions. He was interested in this general realm. I've never met Biden. I don't know what the relationship would be, but I wouldn't be surprised if they knew each other because there would have been contemporaries.
Excellent. Okay, let's see. From Alien Oddity Coins, what does he think of the experiment involving water and plants? I don't know.
Water and plants? If you give a plant water, it will grow. I'm not quite sure what you mean. So I've done experiments, and others have done experiments with intentionally imprinted water, where you mentally try to change the water so that it'll make plants grow better. And yes, I've done that, and that works.
Wow. So that's it. Yeah. Where they take positive reinforcement or positive mental thoughts.
Yeah. You mentally imprint water with the idea that this water will make the plants grow more vigorously. And so the experiment that I did with a colleague in Taiwan, and we invited 3 Buddhist monks at a Buddhist temple in Taiwan, to be the people who would impress their intentions into the water. So we got bottles of water from a commercial bottling plant. You set 3 of them aside as controls, and then had 3 of them set as would be the target of their intention. And then we gave the 2 types of water, to a plant physiologist who was blind as to which water was which, and then did standard growing procedures from seeds, and then later measured various elements of the type of growth of the plant. And then we did the statistics and broke the blind. And sure enough, the seeds that got the treated water did a lot better, statistically way better than the seeds that were getting the same water, but it had not been subject to the blessing.
Yeah, it just seems amazing. Thanks everyone for being here. 626 viewers right now.
Wow.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so we're asking questions till Dr. Radin has to leave. So I want to know his opinion on the Webb telescope. What do you think, Doctor? On the James Webb telescope, do you think it'll have any effect for what your studies or anything?
Well, history shows that every time we have a new instrument or an improved instrument, we learn new things because it extends our senses. And so you can see this like almost literally every time a new way of looking at the world, whole new realms open up that we may not have considered to be there at all beforehand.
Mhm.
So will we learn new things? Yeah, of course we're going to learn new things. Yeah,
Let's
I'm
see.
completely in favor of developing new instruments. In fact, that's one of the things that I try to do, is develop new ways of looking at reality.
Let's see. How can we increase the awareness about the consciousness movement?
Well, it has a certain inertia all by itself now. It used to be rare to find a conference on consciousness. You would find like a sub-discipline of philosophy on mind-body interactions, and you'd go to that conference, and unless you were a philosopher, you would understand nothing. It would be a cure for insomnia. Whereas today, like every month, there is a conference on consciousness of one stripe or another, sometimes from a straight neuroscience perspective, sometimes from a spiritual perspective, everything you can think about. So this is Pandora out of the box already. I don't think this is going to actually end up going back into the box, because more and more people are realizing that consciousness is interesting and something that can be studied, and probably really important too.
Oh, excellent. Okay, then I think we might have asked this. Alana, thank you for being here. What's next experimentally? This will be the last question, Doctor.
Yeah.
How can what's next experimentally? You mentioned your 50-site double slit experiment. If you have anything else, and then how can we get involved? Thanks for your time, from Alana.
Well, so I'm actually not making a double slit. I'm building these things. These will be diffraction patterns. And the reason is that if you take a beam of light and you send it through a diffraction pattern, you know that if you hold it up to the light, you see rainbow effects. There's like 10,000 lines per inch in these things. So they're very popular things that are pretty to look at. But if you send a laser through it, you'll end up with 2 dots. You'll get actually more than that, but you'll end up with 2 dots that you can see with your eye. One is the dot that goes straight through the diffraction pattern, and then 2 dots on either side. And then there's other dots further out, but they're so dim you can't even see them. And the reason why you see these multiple dots is exactly the same reason that you get an interference pattern in a double slit. Yeah, there it is. So what this is not showing is if you send a laser through that, you only get 2 dots. You don't get a spectrum, because the laser is only one frequency of light. But the important part is that it will create an interference pattern. And if you compare the amount of light going directly through versus one of the dots on either side, that shows you how much interference is actually happening. And so this will be very similar then to a double slit system, because you can compare the illumination level of the two dots to how much the mind is so-called collapsing the wave function. So I'm going to make this using a microprocessor and a little diode laser and 2 photodiodes. So it's much, much simpler system with pretty close to the same kind of purpose for doing the experiment. And then it means rather than costing $10,000 to $30,000 to make one of these things, even if you buy a double slit system, they're expensive. This thing will maybe cost $100. Now, I don't know yet because I haven't built it. I built an analog version of it, but I want to build a digital version using a microprocessor. In principle, it'll take me about a year to both build it and then calibrate it and figure out how do I use this in an actual experiment. And once I have that done, I'm pretty sure it's possible. At that point, I'll come up with an experimental design, and that's what I will share with my colleagues. So I'll send them the device. I'll send them a pre-registered way of doing the experiment.
Yes.
Right. So they can play with it as much as they want, but when they get down to doing the formal experiment, they have to follow the rules of what I'll pre-specify. We'll have 50 different sites doing that. Some will be individuals who I know have some talent in this regard. Others will be people at universities who will have a bunch of students do it. And then we'll look at the overall results and see what happened. So I hope it works. I don't actually know at this point if it'll work or not, if it's easily replicable, or maybe only some will replicate it. I don't know, but that's part of the fun of it.
Yeah, it's so cool too. You're basically giving them a replication kit. You know, here's
Right.
how you replicate this.
That's exactly
Wow.
right. This is true actually in this field in general. It's difficult to get anybody else to do these experiments because it takes a certain expertise, it takes time and effort, some dedication to it. But in this realm in particular, it's using optical systems. So a physicist would know how to make this. Actually, anybody who knows how to work with microprocessors would know how to do it. But most of the people I know who are involved in this stuff are psychologists. And they don't have the interest or the expertise to know how to make that system. So I'm making it for them because I'm a psychologist, but my background is electrical engineering. So I know how to do it from just making it. So I'll distribute it to people, and then we'll see what happens.
Wow. Well, excellent, Dr. Radin. You know, I think the UAP Society, my audience at least, is very excited about your work. You know, I'm reading the comments as we go through here. And so, you know, I'm more than happy to have you on later on, maybe later this year, to hear how that experiment's going.
Well, I hope I'll have it to the point where I can show you the little box. I don't know exactly how big a microprocessor is that big. Maybe it'll be a little slightly bigger box, but it won't be very big. It'll be a tiny little thing.
Oh, well, excellent, sir. Thank you so much for everything you do and for your time today. And
You're welcome.
just continue doing it. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great day. Thanks,
Right.
everyone in the audience. Thank you for being here.